April 27, 1736. The Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. A 16-year-old girl stands at the altar in a gown that weighs more than she does. Her hands are shaking. She doesn't understand the words being spoken to her. She's never met the man beside her until 3 hours ago. And then she vomits. All over herself. All over Queen Caroline of England. In front of the entire British court. This is Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. And this is the best moment of her wedding day. Because what comes after, what happens in the months and years following this ceremony, will be so much worse. Within 24 hours, she'll discover her husband has installed his pregnant mistress as her personal attendant. Within a year, courtiers will find her playing with dolls in her chambers, trying to remember what childhood felt like. And in just 16 months, while screaming in labor, her husband will force her into a carriage and drag her through the streets of London, refusing to let her give birth in peace. She'll deliver her first child on a tablecloth. No bed, no preparation, just a crumpled piece of linen on a table, while her husband watches. The wedding of 1736 didn't just ruin Augusta's life. It shattered it into pieces she would spend the next 36 years trying to put back together. This is the story of a girl who arrived in England speaking no English, knowing no one, trusting everyone. And how the British royal family destroyed her before she even understood what was happening. Before we understand what happened to Augusta, we need to understand who she was before 1736. Before the vomiting, before the mistress, before the tablecloth birth. When she was still just a child. Augusta was born on November 30th, 1719, in the Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, a tiny German principality most people couldn't find on a map. Her father, Frederick II, ruled over a territory so small, so insignificant, that survival meant one thing: strategic marriages. Augusta grew up in Gotha Palace with her siblings. She played in gardens. She learned needlework and dancing. She spoke German. Only German. She had no idea she was being watched. Across Europe, in the courts of London, a different kind of calculation was taking place. Prince Frederick of Wales, heir to the British throne, was 29 years old, drowning in debt, and desperately hated by his own parents. King George II and Queen Caroline despised their eldest son. They cut off his allowance. They excluded him from state affairs. They publicly mocked him. Frederick needed leverage. He needed money. He needed heirs. He needed a wife. But not just any wife. He needed someone weak. Someone controllable. Someone with no power, no connections, no ability to challenge him. He needed a child from a nothing principality who would be grateful just to be chosen. Enter Augusta. The Duke of Saxe-Gotha received the marriage proposal in 1735. His daughter, 16 years old, would marry the future King of England. The alliance would elevate their insignificant duchy. It would secure their survival. There was no question of whether Augusta wanted this. There was no conversation about what this would mean for her. The contract was signed. The negotiations concluded. The wedding date set. Augusta was told she was going to England. She was told she would be a princess. She was told this was an honor. What they didn't tell her was that she would never see her home again. In April 1736, Augusta said goodbye to her family, her mother, her siblings, the gardens where she played, the language she spoke, everything familiar. She was put on a ship. The journey across the North Sea was a nightmare. Augusta had never been on a ship before. She was violently seasick for days, vomiting, feverish, terrified. She didn't speak English. No one on the ship could properly communicate with her. She had a small entourage of German attendants, but they were just as frightened as she was. For days, she lay in a cabin, sick and alone, heading toward a country she'd never seen, to marry a man whose face she'd never looked upon. On April 25, 1736, the ship docked at Greenwich. Augusta stepped onto English soil for the first time. She was still pale from seasickness, still shaking, still 16 years old. She looked up at the crowd gathered to greet her, hundreds of strangers all staring, all speaking a language she couldn't understand. Somewhere in that crowd was Prince Frederick, watching her, evaluating her, deciding if she would do. She had 48 hours until the wedding. So who was the man waiting for Augusta at Greenwich? Prince Frederick Louis of Wales, eldest son of King George II, heir to the British throne, and one of the most hated men in England. Not by the public, they barely knew him, but by the two people who mattered most, his own mother and father. Frederick had been born in Hanover in 1707. For the first 14 years of his life, he lived in Germany while his parents moved to England to claim the throne. They left him behind. When they finally brought him to London in 1728, it wasn't out of love. It was obligation. From the moment Frederick arrived in England, the relationship was poison. George II called him the greatest ass, the greatest liar, the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world. His mother, Queen Caroline, was even worse. She openly wished he had never been born. She told courtiers she felt nothing for him. When asked about her son, she said she would rather see him dead than on the throne. This wasn't private resentment. This was public, documented hatred, and Frederick returned it with interest. By 1736, Frederick was 29 years old and locked in total war with his parents. They controlled his money, he was constantly in debt. They excluded him from government, he had no real power. They refused to find him a suitable bride. Because a wife meant heirs, and heirs meant Frederick's claim to the throne became permanent. So Frederick did what any spiteful, desperate prince would do. He lived like he had nothing to lose. He gambled. He drank. He spent money he didn't have on mistresses, parties, and political schemes designed specifically to humiliate his parents. His most public affair was with Vane, an actress and courtesan who became pregnant with his child in 1732. Frederick didn't hide her. He flaunted her. He installed her in his household, gave her a position of honor, and let all of London know she was carrying his illegitimate son. And Vane wasn't his only mistress. There were others, many others. But Anne was special because Frederick could use her to torture his mother. Then, in 1735, everything changed. Parliament and the king's advisors decided Frederick needed to marry, produce legitimate heirs, secure the succession. Frederick saw the opportunity immediately. This wasn't about love. This wasn't even about duty. This was about revenge. If he married, his parents would have to acknowledge him. They'd have to give him money, a proper allowance for a married prince. They'd have to watch as he produced grandchildren they couldn't control. And if he chose the right bride, someone weak, someone insignificant, someone who couldn't challenge him, he could have everything. A wife to produce heirs, a household his parents couldn't interfere with, and the freedom to keep doing exactly what he wanted. Enter Augusta, 16 years old. No English, no power, no allies. Perfect. But Frederick had one more twist planned. He had no intention of letting marriage interfere with his mistresses. So he made a decision that would define Augusta's entire life. He would install his new mistress right in Augusta's household, in a position where she'd see her every single day, where she couldn't escape, where the humiliation would be constant and complete. Courtiers who knew Frederick saw the plan forming. They knew what kind of man he was. They'd seen his cruelty, his callousness, his complete lack of empathy for anyone who couldn't advance his interests. One courtier later wrote that Frederick treated people like chess pieces, moved around, sacrificed, discarded when no longer useful. Augusta would learn this soon enough. But on April 25, 1736, when she stepped off that ship at Greenwich, she didn't know any of this. She didn't know about Vane. She didn't know about the family war. She didn't know that her husband despised his own parents and would use her as a weapon against them. She didn't know that in 48 hours, she'd be vomiting at the altar. And she had no idea that the worst part wasn't the wedding. It was what came after. If you're as horrified by what Frederick was planning as I am, please subscribe to Throne of Lies. Augusta had no one to defend her, but you can help us tell her story to the world. Hit that subscribe button. April 27, 1736. The day started at dawn. Augusta woke in a room at St. James's Palace. a building she'd never seen before yesterday. She'd been in England for exactly 48 hours. At 8 in the morning, her German attendants came to prepare her. They spoke softly, trying to calm her, but they couldn't hide their own fear, because at 9 o'clock, Augusta was going to meet her husband for the first time. Not at the altar. That would come later. No, Frederick had scheduled a private meeting. Just the two of them. 3 hours before the wedding. The door opened. Prince Frederick walked in. Augusta curtsied, the only response she'd been trained for. Frederick looked at her, up and down, evaluating. He said something in English. She didn't understand a word. He tried again, slower this time, still English. Augusta stared at him, terrified, silent. One of her attendants stepped forward and attempted to translate, but the conversation was stilted, awkward, impossible. Frederick asked questions about her journey, about her family, about whether she understood what was expected of her tonight. Augusta's face turned red. She looked at the floor. Frederick shrugged. He'd seen enough. He left the room after less than 10 minutes. That was it. That was their first meeting. 10 minutes with a translator. 3 hours before they'd be married for life. At 11 o'clock, the real preparation began. Augusta was stripped and redressed by women she'd never met. They pulled her into a wedding gown. Layers of silk and brocade that weighed over 30 pounds. The corset beneath was laced so tight she could barely breathe. She tried to tell them it hurt. They didn't understand her. Or they didn't care. She was powdered, painted, jeweled. Her hair was styled in the English fashion. High, elaborate, pinned until her scalp ached. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. At noon, she was led to the chapel royal. The chapel was packed. Hundreds of courtiers, nobles, foreign dignitaries, all crowding into the pews, all staring at the small German girl who could barely walk under the weight of her dress. King George II was there. Queen Caroline was there. Every important person in England was there. And at the front of the chapel stood Frederick, waiting. The ceremony began. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke in English. Augusta didn't understand him. He asked her questions. She'd been coached on when to say, "I will," but she didn't know what she was agreeing to. The vows continued. The rings were exchanged. And then something went wrong. Augusta's face went pale. Her breathing quickened. The corset was too tight. The room was too hot. The smell of incense and hundreds of bodies packed together was overwhelming. She'd been seasick for days. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. She was terrified, exhausted, and couldn't breathe. Her stomach turned. She tried to hold it back. She pressed her hand to her mouth. It didn't help. Augusta vomited. All over the front of her wedding gown. All over the Archbishop's vestments. And, because Queen Caroline was standing close enough to assist the bride, all over the Queen of England. The chapel went silent. Every eye in the room locked onto Augusta, the girl who just humiliated herself, her husband, and the Queen in front of the entire British court. Queen Caroline stepped back, her gown ruined. Her face was a mask of fury and disgust. Frederick didn't move, didn't reach for Augusta, didn't ask if she was all right. He just stood there, staring at her. The ceremony continued, because royal weddings don't stop for vomit. Augusta was cleaned as best as possible, attendants dabbing at her dress, trying to wipe away the stains. She was shaking now, crying silently, her face still pale. The Archbishop finished the vows. Prince Frederick and Princess Augusta were declared man and wife. The crowd applauded, politely, awkwardly. Augusta didn't hear them. She was somewhere else now, locked inside her own humiliation, replaying the moment over and over. The reception followed. Hours of it. Augusta sat beside Frederick at the high table, unable to eat, unable to speak. Courtiers whispered. The gossip had already started. Did you see the princess vomit on the queen? Poor thing couldn't even make it through the ceremony. Frederick must be furious. What kind of princess can't hold herself together for 1 hour? But the worst part wasn't the gossip. The worst part was still coming. That night, Augusta was escorted to the bridal chamber. Another room she'd never seen. Another bed she'd never slept in. Frederick was already there. What happened next was recorded by one of Augusta's German attendants, who later wrote that the princess was in great distress and utterly afraid. Frederick didn't speak to her, didn't try to comfort her, didn't acknowledge that she'd been sick, that she'd been humiliated, that this was her first time away from her family. He expected consummation. Immediately, Augusta was 16 years old. She didn't understand what was happening. She tried to speak, tried to ask questions in broken English she'd barely learned. Frederick ignored her. The attendants were dismissed. The door was closed. What happened in that room wasn't recorded in detail, because royal consummations were private. But we know this, Augusta cried, loudly enough that attendants outside the door heard her. Frederick stayed in the room for less than an hour, and when he left, he didn't look back. Augusta spent her wedding night alone, crying in a bed too big for one person. In a country where no one spoke her language, married to a man who treated her like an obligation he'd already fulfilled. She was now Princess of Wales, and her nightmare had only just begun. The morning after the wedding, Augusta woke alone. Frederick was already gone. No explanation, no note, no indication of when or if he'd return. She dressed with the help of her German attendants. They were the only people in the entire palace she could speak to. At 10 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. A woman entered. English, elegant, confident in a way Augusta would never be. She introduced herself in rapid English that Augusta couldn't follow. One of the attendants translated. This was Lady Archibald Hamilton, and several other women who would serve as Augusta's ladies of the bedchamber. But one introduction made Augusta freeze. The woman standing at the back of the group, younger than the others, beautiful, and visibly pregnant. Her name was Vain, and she was Frederick's mistress. Augusta didn't understand at first. The translation was confusing. The German attendant hesitated, trying to find a polite way to explain what mistress meant. But Augusta wasn't stupid. She saw the way Vain looked at her, the slight smile, the confidence. She saw the way the other ladies avoided Anne's eyes, embarrassed, uncomfortable. And then one of her attendants whispered the truth. This woman, this pregnant woman, was carrying Frederick's child. And Frederick had given her a position in Augusta's household. The position of First Lady of the Bedchamber. Do you understand what that meant? The First Lady of the Bedchamber wasn't some distant courtier. This was the woman who attended to Augusta's most intimate needs, who helped her dress, who was present in her private chambers, who had access to her every single day. This was the woman who would watch Augusta try and fail to get pregnant with Frederick's legitimate child, while she herself carried his bastard. Frederick had done this on purpose. And Vain wasn't new to Frederick's life. She'd been his mistress since 1732. For years before Augusta even arrived in England, she was an actress and courtesan, known throughout London's social circles. In 1732, she'd given birth to Frederick's illegitimate son, Frederick Vain. Frederick acknowledged the child, supported him financially, made no effort to hide the affair. When Anne became pregnant again in 1735, Frederick didn't send her away. He promoted her. By the time Augusta arrived in 1736, Anne Vain was already installed in Frederick's household, and Frederick made sure she stayed there after the wedding. Every morning, Anne Vain entered Augusta's chambers. Every morning, Augusta had to face the woman who shared her husband's bed. The court watched. Some felt pity for Augusta, this child bride who'd been humiliated on her wedding day and now had to endure public betrayal. But most just gossiped. Frederick's mistress dresses the princess. Poor Augusta. Barely speaks English and already replaced. He didn't even wait a week before going back to Anne. Augusta tried to navigate the situation. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She nodded when she was supposed to nod. But she was drowning. She had no friends. The English ladies at court either ignored her or pitied her. And Augusta couldn't tell which was worse. She couldn't speak to Frederick. He was rarely home. And when he treated her like furniture, necessary but unremarkable. She couldn't write to her family. Her letters were monitored, controlled. So Augusta did the only thing she could do. She retreated. In 1737, 1 year after her wedding, courtiers reported something that shocked them. They found Princess Augusta in her private chambers, playing with dolls. Not as a joke, not as a performance, actually playing. Arranging tiny furniture, dressing the dolls in miniature gowns. She was 17 years old, married, expected to produce heirs, and she was playing with dolls. When the courtiers told her to stop, that it was inappropriate, that she needed to act like a princess, Augusta cried, because those dolls were the only things in England that felt familiar, the only things that reminded her of home, the only things she could control. And Vane didn't mock her for it, and didn't need to, and had already won. But then, in September 1736, just 5 months after Augusta's wedding, something unexpected happened, and Vane died, suddenly, mysteriously. Some said it was complications from childbirth. Others whispered poison, though nothing was ever proven. Augusta must have felt something when she heard the news. Relief? Guilt? Hope? Maybe she thought, finally, now things will get better. She was wrong, because Frederick didn't mourn in vain. He replaced her. Within weeks, there were rumors of new mistresses, new women entering Frederick's household, new faces Augusta would have to see every day. Frederick made sure Augusta understood the message. She was his wife, his breeding tool, his political pawn, but she would never be enough. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it. By late 1736, Augusta had been in England for 8 months. She'd survived the wedding. She'd survived en vain. She'd survived the gossip and the isolation. But she hadn't understood the real reason Frederick married her. Until now, Frederick didn't need a wife for companionship. He didn't even need her for heirs, not yet. He needed her as a weapon. Remember, Frederick was at war with his parents. King George II and Queen Caroline controlled his money, his reputation, his access to power. They humiliated him publicly. They made sure everyone knew how much they despised their own son. So Frederick built his own power base. He aligned himself with the political opposition, the men who hated King George II. He hosted meetings at his residence. He funded pamphlets attacking his father's policies. And he used Augusta to make it all look legitimate. Everywhere Frederick went, Augusta went. He paraded her through London, took her to the theater, brought her to political gatherings where she sat silently, smiling on command, while men she couldn't understand discussed strategies she knew nothing about. Frederick made sure the public saw them together. The young, devoted couple, the Prince and Princess of Wales. So much more relatable than the cold, German-speaking king and queen. It was propaganda, pure and calculated. Augusta didn't understand any of it. She stood where she was told to stand. She smiled when she was told to smile. She wore the gowns Frederick's staff selected, always chosen to make a statement, to contrast with Queen Caroline's style. One witness described Augusta during this period as looking like a painted doll, beautiful, silent, and completely hollow. But the cruelty went deeper than public displays. Frederick controlled everything about Augusta's life. She had no money, none. Every penny she needed for clothing, for personal items, for anything, had to be approved by Frederick. She tried to write letters home, to her mother, to her siblings, letters where she could be honest, where she could ask for help. Frederick's staff intercepted them. They read every word. They edited out anything that made Frederick look bad. They rewrote entire sections to make it seem like Augusta was happy, thriving, grateful. Her family back in Saxe-Gotha received letters that barely sounded like Augusta at all. And when her mother wrote back, worried, suspicious, those letters were read before Augusta ever saw them. Her parents knew something was wrong. They had to. But what could they do? Saxe-Gotha was a minor principality. They had no leverage over Britain, no way to demand better treatment for their daughter. They needed this alliance. Their survival depended on staying in Britain's good graces. So they stayed silent, and Augusta remained trapped. Then, in early 1737, everything shifted. Augusta was pregnant. Finally, her purpose was being fulfilled. She was doing the one thing Frederick actually needed from her: producing an heir. The court celebrated. King George II and Queen Caroline were forced to acknowledge the pregnancy publicly. Frederick received increased financial support from Parliament because a married prince with children on the way needed proper funding. Frederick had won another battle against his parents. And Augusta? She was terrified. Childbirth in the 18th century was one of the leading causes of death for women. Augusta would have heard the stories: women who bled out, women who died from infection, women whose babies got stuck and had to be cut out while they screamed. Queen Caroline herself had nearly died giving birth multiple times. And now it was Augusta's turn. She was 17 years old, still playing with dolls in private, still barely able to speak English, and she was about to give birth in a foreign country, surrounded by strangers, with a husband who saw her as nothing more than a political tool. The court expected her to be grateful, honored, excited. Augusta spent her pregnancy in quiet, mounting dread, because somewhere deep down she knew Frederick wasn't going to let her give birth in peace. He was going to use this, just like he used everything else, as another weapon against his parents. And Augusta was going to pay the price. Augusta was completely alone. No advocates, no voice, no escape. But her story deserves to be heard. If you believe these forgotten victims of royal cruelty need justice, even 300 years later, please subscribe to Throne of Lies. Your support means we can keep researching these untold stories. Don't let Augusta be forgotten again. July 31st, 1737. Augusta was 9 months pregnant. Her body was exhausted, swollen. Every movement hurt. She was staying at Hampton Court Palace, a massive royal residence outside London where the king and queen spent their summers. Queen Caroline had insisted Augusta stay there for the birth, close by, where she could be present, where royal physicians could attend to her. Frederick hated that. His mother, controlling his wife's pregnancy, deciding where his child would be born, making herself part of the moment. So Frederick made a plan. He waited, watched, and the moment Augusta's labor began, he acted. It was late evening. Augusta's contractions started around 10 o'clock. Sharp pains that made her double over. Her attendants recognized the signs immediately. Labor had begun. They sent word to Queen Caroline. They prepared the birthing room. They called for the physicians. And then Frederick burst in. He told Augusta they were leaving. Right now. Augusta didn't understand. She was in labor. She could barely stand. Why would they leave? Frederick didn't explain. He ordered her attendants to dress her, get her ready for travel. The attendants protested. One of them, Mrs. Towers, begged Frederick to reconsider. Augusta was in active labor. Moving her was dangerous. The baby could come at any moment. Frederick didn't care. He wanted his child born at St. James's Palace in London, not here under his mother's roof. This wasn't about Augusta's safety. This wasn't about the baby. This was about winning, about making sure Queen Caroline couldn't claim any part of this birth. Augusta was crying now, contractions coming faster. She tried to speak, tried to tell Frederick she couldn't travel. He ignored her. At 11 o'clock, Augusta was carried out of Hampton Court and placed into a carriage with no cushions, no proper support, nothing to make the journey bearable. The road from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace was over 10 miles, rough, unpaved in sections. Every bump sent shockwaves through Augusta's body. She screamed. The contractions were relentless now, coming every few minutes. Her water broke inside the carriage, soaking through her gown, through the seat. The attendants riding with her were frantic. They begged the driver to stop, to turn back. Frederick, riding in the carriage with Augusta, refused. They kept going. For over an hour, Augusta endured that journey, writhing in pain, screaming. begging in broken English and desperate German for them to stop. Frederick sat across from her, watching. One attendant later wrote that Frederick seemed utterly unmoved by his wife's suffering. Finally, around midnight, the carriage arrived at St. James's Palace. They carried Augusta inside, and that's when everyone realized the problem. No one had prepared for this. There was no birthing room ready, no bed made, no physicians waiting. Because no one expected Frederick to actually go through with this insane plan. They found a room, any room, and brought Augusta inside. There was no proper bed, just a daybed. Too small, too narrow. The attendants scrambled. They grabbed whatever linens they could find. Tablecloths. They spread tablecloths across the daybed and laid Augusta down. She was fully dilated now. The baby was coming whether anyone was ready or not. Mrs. Cannons, one of the attendants, later testified that Augusta was in the most extreme agony, and that the princess wept and cried out in German, calling for her mother. The midwife arrived. Then the physicians, all of them shocked at the scene. A princess, heir to the British throne, giving birth on tablecloths in an unprepared room because her husband couldn't stand the thought of his mother being present. At 1:30 in the morning, Augusta gave birth. A girl, tiny, premature, but alive. They named her Augusta after her mother. The baby survived. Against all odds, she survived. But Augusta nearly didn't. She hemorrhaged, badly. The physicians worked for hours to stop the bleeding. Infection was almost certain. The room wasn't sterile. The linens weren't clean. Augusta's body had been subjected to trauma that would have killed most women. One physician later wrote that he fully expected the princess to die within days. She didn't die, but she came close. While Augusta lay bleeding and barely conscious, the scandal exploded. Queen Caroline was furious when she found out what Frederick had done, that he'd dragged Augusta through London in active labor, that he'd forced her to give birth on tablecloths in an unprepared room. She publicly condemned her own son. She called him a monster. She told courtiers that Frederick had nearly murdered his wife out of pure spite. King George II was equally appalled. He launched an investigation. He demanded answers, but Frederick didn't apologize. He'd gotten what he wanted. His child was born at St. James's Palace, not Hampton Court. His mother hadn't been there. He'd won. The cost was almost Augusta's life, and he didn't care. The scandal spread across Europe. Foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports back to their home countries. Newspapers published accounts, some exaggerated but many accurate. Even by Georgian standards, an era known for callousness and cruelty. What Frederick did was considered monstrous. One member of parliament called it the most unnatural act of a husband I have ever witnessed. Augusta recovered slowly. Took weeks before she could walk without help. Months before the physical trauma faded. But the psychological damage? That never healed. She'd learned something that night. Something she could never unlearn. Her husband would sacrifice her, would risk her life for the smallest political victory. And there was no one who could stop him. The tablecloth birth was just the beginning. Over the next 14 years, Augusta would be pregnant 9 times. 9 pregnancies, 9 labors. 9 times her body was pushed to the edge of survival. In the 18th century, this was expected. Royal women were breeding machines. Their value was measured in heirs. But for Augusta, each pregnancy was a reminder of that night in 1737. She gave birth to her second child, George, in 1738, then Edward in 1739, Elizabeth in 1741, William in 1743, Henry in 1745, Louisa in 1749, Frederick in 1750, Caroline in 1751. Some sources suggest there were miscarriages between these births, pregnancies that didn't survive, but those weren't recorded. Royal miscarriages were kept quiet, buried. Augusta's body never recovered. She was constantly pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. No time to heal. No time to regain strength. By her mid-20s, witnesses described her as looking worn and exhausted. Her teeth were falling out, a common result of repeated pregnancies that drained calcium from her body. She developed what doctors called a nervous disposition, anxiety, panic attacks, an inability to be in crowded rooms without trembling. We call it trauma now, PTSD. But in 1740, they just called her melancholic. And through it all, Frederick continued his affairs. He didn't bother hiding them anymore. New mistresses rotated through his household. He spent nights away. He made sure Augusta knew she was replaceable. But something changed in Augusta during these years. She learned English, slowly, painfully, but by 1740, she could finally understand what people were saying about her. She could read the letters Frederick's staff had been editing. She could hear the gossip the courtiers whispered. She could understand exactly what her husband said when he mocked her to his friends. And for the first time, Augusta fought back. Not publicly. She couldn't. Frederick controlled everything. But privately, in small ways, she resisted. She found solace in religion, spent hours in chapel, prayed for strength she didn't feel. She took up gardening, created private spaces at Kew Palace where she could be alone, where no one watched her, where she didn't have to perform. And most importantly, she focused on her children. Augusta became fiercely protective of them, especially her eldest son, George. George, born in 1738, was fragile, sickly, shy. Frederick largely ignored him, disappointed that his heir wasn't more robust. But Augusta saw something else. She saw a child who needed protection, who needed to be shielded from his father's cruelty. She homeschooled George herself, taught him languages, encouraged his interest in science and agriculture. She did the same for her other children. Edward, Elizabeth, William, she kept them close, controlled their education, made sure they knew she loved them. But her protection came with a price. Augusta's relationship with her children was intense. Smothering, some said. She couldn't let them out of her sight, couldn't trust anyone else to care for them, because she knew what happened when you trusted the wrong people. She knew what happened when you had no control. Courtiers described Augusta during this period as anxious to the point of obsession about her children's safety. One lady-in-waiting wrote that Augusta would check on her sleeping children multiple times each night, terrified they'd stop breathing. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. Augusta had lost control of every other aspect of her life. Her children were the only thing she could still protect. And then, in March 1751, everything changed. Frederick was at a garden party, healthy, laughing, drinking. He complained of a chill, then a cough. Within days, he was bedridden. Within 2 weeks, he was dead. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lungs. Some historians suspect an abscess from an old cricket injury that had never healed properly. Others whispered poison, though nothing was ever proven. Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales, died on March 20th, 1751. He was 44 years old. Augusta was 31. She'd been married for 15 years, pregnant for most of them, humiliated, controlled, and abused. And now, suddenly, her tormentor was gone. The court expected her to mourn, to wear black, to weep publicly. Augusta did what was expected. But witnesses reported something strange. When Augusta first received the news of Frederick's death, she didn't cry. She stood silently for several minutes, staring at nothing. And then she asked a single question. "Is it certain?" When they confirmed Frederick was truly dead, not ill, not injured, but dead, Augusta nodded. She thanked them, and then she went to tell her children. One courtier later wrote, "I expected the princess to collapse in grief. Instead, she seemed relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted, because it had been. For the first time since 1736, for the first time since she stepped off that ship at Greenwich, Augusta was free, or so she thought." Frederick's death should have freed Augusta. Didn't, because now she had a different problem. Her son George was 12 years old, and he'd just become heir to the British throne. King George II, Augusta's father-in-law, the man who'd allowed Frederick to torture her, was still alive. still ruling. But he was old, 71, and everyone knew his death was coming, which meant George would become king while still a child. And Augusta, the woman they'd humiliated, controlled, and nearly killed, would become the most powerful person in England, Dowager Princess of Wales, mother of the future king, de facto regent. The court watched her carefully now. Augusta moved quickly. She took full control of George's education, hired tutors she trusted, removed anyone connected to Frederick's old political circle. She kept George isolated, protected, some said smothered. George wasn't allowed to make decisions without her approval. He wasn't allowed friends she hadn't vetted. He rarely left her sight. One tutor described George as anxious, stammering, and entirely dependent on his mother's guidance. Augusta had become exactly what Frederick's cruelty had created. A woman so terrified of losing control that she controlled everything. But the court didn't see trauma. They saw ambition. Rumors started almost immediately. Augusta was accused of having an affair with John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, George's tutor and her close advisor. There was no evidence. None. But that didn't matter. A widow with political power? Of course she must be sleeping with someone. Pamphlets circulated. Cartoons depicted Augusta and Bute in compromising positions. Songs mocked her as the German whore. It was Frederick all over again, except this time Augusta could fight back. She ignored the rumors, focused on George, built alliances with politicians who respected her intelligence. Because Augusta had learned something during her years with Frederick. Power wasn't about love. It wasn't about respect. It was about control. In 1760, King George II died. George III, Augusta's eldest son, became King of England at age 22, and Augusta remained the most influential person in his life. She didn't take an official title. She didn't need one. George consulted her on everything: policy decisions, marriage prospects, political appointments. He trusted her completely, too completely. Historians later noted that George III's early reign was marked by unusual deference to his mother's opinions. Augusta had raised him to depend on her, to need her, and now, finally, she had the power to protect him the way no one had protected her. But the trauma never left. Courtiers documented Augusta's nervous episodes. She couldn't sleep. She obsessively checked on her children, even the adult ones, multiple times a day. She developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety and control issues. She couldn't trust anyone outside her immediate circle. She saw threats everywhere. One lady-in-waiting wrote, "The Dowager Princess lives in constant fear, though of what, I cannot say." Augusta knew what she feared. She feared losing control, losing her children, becoming powerless again. She feared becoming the 16-year-old girl on that ship, heading toward a nightmare she couldn't escape. By the late 1760s, Augusta's health began to fail. She developed throat pain, difficulty swallowing, weight loss. Doctors examined her. They found a growth in her throat. Cancer, almost certainly throat cancer. Treatment in 1770 meant nothing. There was no cure, no relief. Augusta suffered for 2 years. The pain was constant. She could barely eat, barely speak. On February 8, 1772, Augusta died at Carlton House in London. She was 52 years old. George III was devastated. He mourned publicly and genuinely. But the rest of England? They barely noticed. Augusta's death was recorded in the papers. A few lines. No grand tributes. No national mourning. The woman who'd survived Frederick, who'd raised a king, who'd endured 15 years of cruelty and somehow kept going. Forgotten. For centuries, historians remembered Augusta, when they remembered her at all, as a controversial figure. Ambitious, controlling, possibly corrupt. The affair rumors stuck. The accusations of manipulation stuck. What didn't stick was the truth. That Augusta was 16 when she was sold to a monster. That she vomited at her own wedding and spent her wedding night crying alone. that she gave birth on tablecloths because her husband valued spite over her life, that she endured 9 pregnancies, countless humiliations, and complete isolation in a country that never wanted her. Modern historians are finally reassessing Augusta's story. We see the control issues as trauma responses now, the smothering of George III as protective behavior born from years of powerlessness, the anxiety, the fear, the inability to trust. These weren't character flaws. They were survival mechanisms. Augusta spent 36 years trying to recover from 1736. She never did, because some damage can't be undone. Some nightmares don't end even after the monster dies. Augusta's story is horrific. But here's what makes it worse. She wasn't unique. Across Europe in the 1700s, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of Princess Augustas. Girls sold into marriages they didn't want. Children shipped to foreign countries. Brides who couldn't speak the language of their own wedding vows. We just don't know their names. In 1721, a 12-year-old French princess was married to the King of Spain. She died 4 years later, never having produced an heir. Historians barely mention her. In 1745, a 14-year-old was married to the Duke of Parma. She had 11 pregnancies in 13 years. 7 of her children died in infancy. Her name appears in genealogy charts, nothing more. In 1770, a 15-year-old Austrian archduchess was sent to France to marry the Dauphin. We remember her, Marie Antoinette, because of how she died. But we forget how she lived. Terrified, isolated, used. Just like Augusta, child brides weren't exceptions in royal families. They were the system, because marriages weren't about love. They weren't even about producing heirs, not really. They were about alliances, treaties, power, and girls were the currency. The younger, the better, because young brides were easier to control, easier to mold, less likely to resist. One historian estimated that between 1700 and 1800, at least 40% of European royal marriages involved brides under the age of 17. Many were 14, 15, 16. Some were younger, and childbirth killed them. In the 18th century, death in childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women aged 15 to 40. For royal women, who were expected to have as many children as possible, as quickly as possible, the risk was even higher. One study of European royal families found that nearly 25% of royal women died from childbirth complications or pregnancy-related causes. 1 in 4. And those are just the deaths we know about. The ones recorded. The ones considered important enough to document. What about the miscarriages? The stillbirths? The children who died within hours? What about the women who survived childbirth but never recovered? Who lived with infections, with internal injuries, with bodies destroyed by repeated pregnancies? Those stories weren't recorded, because they didn't matter. The system demanded heirs. If a woman died producing them, well, that's what second wives were for. This wasn't cruelty in the sense of individual malice. This was systemic cruelty, built into the structure of royalty itself. Royal breeding programs treated women like livestock, evaluated for fertility, inspected before marriage to ensure they were suitable, married off as teenagers, bred until their bodies gave out. And if they complained, if they resisted, they were punished, isolated, replaced, just like Augusta. Now here's the part that should disturb you. This still happens. Child marriage still exists. Right now. In 2024. Over 12 million girls under the age of 18 are married every year. Many are under 15. They're married to men they don't know, in countries where they don't speak the language, to families that see them as property. The reasons are different. Economics instead of politics, poverty instead of alliances, but the result is the same. Girls whose lives are destroyed before they begin. And just like in Augusta's time, we don't count them. We don't know their names. We don't hear their stories. Their statistics. Numbers in reports published by NGOs that most people never read. Augusta's story matters because it gives us a window. It shows us what happens when a girl is treated as currency. When her body is not her own. when she has no voice, no power, no escape. It shows us the trauma that lasts decades, the control issues, the anxiety, the desperate need to protect the children she finally has power over. It shows us what we're still doing to girls around the world. Different century, different countries, same cruelty. Augusta vomited at her wedding, gave birth on tablecloths, played with dolls at 17 because she was trying to remember what it felt like to be safe. And history almost forgot her. How many others have we already forgotten? How many girls suffered through marriages just as horrific, and left no record at all? How many died in childbirth, alone and terrified, in palaces across Europe? How many were buried in unmarked graves, their names erased, their stories lost? We'll never know. But we know Augusta's story now, and that means something. Princess Augusta suffered for decades, and history almost erased her completely. The only reason we know her story now is because people like you care enough to listen. These women deserve to be remembered, and Throne of Lies needs your help to make that happen. Don't let this be the last time you hear Augusta's name. April 27, 1736. A 16-year-old girl steps off a ship at Greenwich. She's seasick, terrified. She doesn't speak English. Within 48 hours, she'll meet her husband for the first time. She'll vomit at her own wedding. She'll spend her wedding night crying alone. Within a year, she'll be forced to live with her husband's pregnant mistress. She'll be caught playing with dolls, desperately trying to hold on to childhood. Within 16 months, she'll be dragged through London in labor, screaming, bleeding, and forced to give birth on tablecloths because her husband cares more about spite than her survival. She'll have 9 pregnancies over 14 years. Her body will never recover. She'll spend 36 years trying to heal from trauma that started the moment she arrived in England. And she'll die at 52, remembered, if at all, as controversial, controlling, ambitious, not as a victim. This is Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. And 1736 didn't just ruin her wedding day. It destroyed her entire life. Augusta's legacy lived on through her children, especially George III, the king who ruled Britain for 60 years, who lost the American colonies, who descended into madness in his later years. Historians have spent centuries analyzing George III's mental illness, his paranoia, his control issues, his breakdowns. But how much of that came from Augusta? How much of George's anxiety was learned behavior? Watching his mother check on him obsessively, seeing her inability to trust anyone, absorbing her trauma like a lesson? Augusta raised a king, but she raised him in the shadow of her own nightmare. Through George III, Augusta's bloodline continued. His children, his grandchildren. Queen Victoria was Augusta's great-great-granddaughter. The current British royal family, they're Augusta's descendants. Every single one of them carries her blood, but none of them know her story. So here's the question we have to ask. Was Augusta just a victim, or did she perpetuate the cycle? Because Augusta raised George III to depend on her completely. She controlled every aspect of his life. She made him afraid of the world. Some historians argue that Augusta, traumatized and desperate for control, damaged her own son in ways that affected his entire reign, that she turned her victim status into a weapon, used her suffering as justification to smother George until he couldn't function without her. Maybe that's true, or maybe that's exactly what trauma does. It doesn't turn victims into saints, turns them into survivors. And survivors do what they have to do to feel safe, even if it hurts the people they love. Augusta never had a chance to heal, never had therapy, never had anyone acknowledge what Frederick did to her. She just had to keep going. And she did the best she could with the tools she had. Which brings us to the Throne of Lies. For centuries, royal propaganda hid these stories. The vomiting at the wedding turned into gossip, a joke. The tablecloth birth, framed as Frederick's eccentricity. The mistress in Augusta's household, barely mentioned. Augusta's trauma, rewritten as ambition, as manipulation, a scandal, because that's what royal families do. They bury the ugly parts. They rewrite the narrative. They make sure history remembers crowns and conquests, not the 16-year-old girls who vomited from fear. But we know now. We know what happened to Augusta. We know she suffered. We know she never recovered. And we owe her, and the thousands of women like her, the truth. We owe them their names, their stories, their pain acknowledged. Because these weren't just tragedies. They were crimes, sanctioned by law, celebrated by society, hidden by propaganda. And if we don't remember them, if we let these stories disappear, we're complicit. So remember Augusta. Remember the girl who played with dolls because she couldn't handle being a princess. Remember the woman who gave birth on tablecloths because her husband valued cruelty over her life. Remember the mother who smothered her son because she was terrified of losing him the way she'd lost everything else. Remember her, not as a controversial figure, not as an ambitious manipulator, but as a 16-year-old child who was sold, abused, and broken, and who, despite everything, survived. Picture her one last time. April 1736. Before the ship docked. Before she met Frederick. Before the wedding. Before the nightmare. Just a girl. 16 years old. Scared, but hopeful. Still believing that England might be kind. Still believing her life could be good. That girl deserved better. They all did. If the story affected you, subscribe to Throne of Lies. We're dedicated to uncovering the royal scandals history tried to bury. These women deserve to be remembered.